Welcome to This Explainer. Look, we've all had the debate, right? Could Jack have fit on that floating door? We've all been there. But today, we're zooming out and looking at a deeply critical source that asks us to completely rethink the entire narrative that even led up to that icy water. I mean, Titanic is etched into our cultural memory as the absolute peak of cinematic romance, the ultimate story of two people defying the odds. But the analysis we're unpacking today presents a pretty harsh critique. It claims that what we all collectively watched and probably cried over, well, it wasn't actually love at all. Yeah, the source material hits us right out of the gate with this bold, cold open thesis. This is not love. It's basically asking us to just pause the swelling soundtrack, ignore the beautiful costumes and sweeping camera angles, and critically re-examine our own memory of the film through a very specific, uncompromising lens. It literally demands that we look strictly at the bare facts of the plot.
Okay, let's dive into this and map out exactly how we're going to systematically unpack this highly structured critique. First, we're looking at the three-day illusion. Then, we move to the noble-poor paradox. Third is the voyeuristic camera. And we'll wrap up with Hollywood's greatest trick.
Starting off with Section 1, the three-day illusion, romance versus reality. Now, what's really interesting about this first major argument is how the author challenges us to just strip away all that grand, romanticized vocabulary the film feeds us. The source asks us to completely set aside empty words like soulmates. We really have to contrast the celebrated Hollywood myth, destined soulmates breaking through rigid social classes, with the author's deeply skeptical reality. They argue that what we're actually watching isn't destiny at all. It's lust, it's impulse, and ultimately, it's seduction masquerading as a profound connection.
And the entire core of this first argument, it really comes down to a single, stark number: 3. According to the source's calculations, from the absolute very first moment Jack and Rose lock eyes on the deck till the time they sleep together, the elapsed time was no more than 3 days.
Seriously, when we map out the timeline, the reality is incredibly compressed. Think about it. The Titanic sets sail on April 10th, 1912. The so-called love scene happens on just the third day of the voyage. And by the night of April 14th, boom, the ship hits the iceberg. The total time they spent alive together on that ship was literally less than 4 days. It's kind of wild to think about how many tears we've all shed over a relationship that barely lasted a weekend. The critic makes a sharp point here. A man sleeping with an engaged woman after knowing her for just 72 hours is, in reality, a one-night stand. In any normal culture, the author argues, this would be seen as a reckless impulse, perhaps even something cheap. But if you slap the label love on it, you're giving that word a burden it simply doesn't deserve. The source actually takes this critique a step further, framing the dynamic as outright manipulation. They state, a broke, homeless painter uses the oldest line in the book on a rich woman who is unhappy with her fiancé. The author notes that looking at someone and saying, you are special, you don't belong here, well, that isn't some magical romantic encounter. According to this critique, it is textbook seduction. It's perfectly designed to take advantage of a woman's obvious emotional vulnerability. Moving on to Section 2, the noble-poor paradox, character morality. Here, the critic asks the viewer a very direct and honestly somewhat uncomfortable question. Are the poor really noble and honest? You see, Hollywood relies heavily on this trope, right? They constantly portray the lower-class character as this symbol of pure virtue, completely untainted by the greed of high society. The author forces us to hit pause here and reconsider a cinematic trope we've probably all accepted without a second thought. So the crucial point is, what does Jack actually do in the narrative if we completely divorce his actions from his charming demeanor? Let's just walk through the facts. First, he knows, definitively, that Rose is already engaged to be married. Second, despite knowing this, he takes her to a secluded car. And third, he sleeps with her after an incredibly brief 3-day acquaintance. The source challenges us to really think critically about this. Would a person with a genuine moral bottom line, a truly noble and honest person, actively seduce an engaged woman? This illustrates a glaring contradiction that the filmmakers seemingly hoped we'd just ignore. We have Hollywood's celebration of the virtuous, honest artist directly clashing with the narrative reality. He actively seduces an engaged woman without any moral hesitation whatsoever. The author points out the incredible irony here. Hollywood celebrates the poor on one hand, but on the other, they write this supposedly noble character into committing actions that completely contradict that very nobility.
Which brings us to Section 3, the voyeuristic camera, a technical critique.
Let's move to the technical analysis and see how this builds. Shifting away from character critique, the source deconstructs the cinematography of that infamous car scene step by step. Step 1, the camera creeps low toward the car. Step 2, it slowly, deliberately circles around the vehicle. Step 3, it finally presses right up against the fogged-up glass. The author pays really close attention to this mechanical progression, pointing out that the filmmakers are actively, physically guiding the audience's eyes. The source uses these steps to define the scene through the very specific lens of voyeurism. The author argues, quite passionately actually, that this camera perspective doesn't belong to a lover, and it's definitely not some objective, omniscient, God's eye view of the action. Instead, it precisely simulates the viewing angle of a peeping Tom. The critique suggests the filmmakers are basically holding your hand, leading you closer and closer, forcing you to lie down against that foggy window and strain to see inside. The source actually goes as far as describing this directorial choice as disgusting.
And the author expresses deep dismay at how successfully this technique actually works, arguing that the entire world is literally led into a collective act of peeping. Think about it. Millions of people sitting in dark theaters, entirely manipulated by the camera's path, watching this highly constructed, voyeuristic angle with rapt attention and tears in their eyes. And the crazy part? We're all entirely unaware of what the camera is forcing us to be. Finally, we arrive at Section 4, Hollywood's greatest trick, packaging the illusion. Here, the source summarizes its overarching conclusion about how masterfully the film industry manipulates our emotions and our perceptions. The author delivers the absolute gut punch of their thesis with this powerful quote. They say Hollywood's true skill is turning seduction into a classic and packaging voyeurism as art. It's a really striking summary of the entire critique. It argues that what we are universally applauding as a masterpiece of cinematic brilliance is actually something much more base, just elegantly dressed up in million-dollar production values. This brings the entire argument into focus, and frankly, it forces us to ask why this even matters. Well, it matters because how our media packages these stories deeply shapes our cultural understanding of romance. The author sees this massive, unbridgeable gulf between the film's facade, a timeless love story and high cinematic art, and the harsh reality of cheap manipulation. The source insists that taking an engaged woman to bed after 3 days isn't epic love, it's an affair. And forcing the audience to peep through a low-angle lens isn't high art at all, it's just cheap. Which leaves us with this final, very provocative question straight from the source material to ponder. If the filmmakers went to such incredible lengths to construct this romantic illusion, how far do they go with the actual historical facts? The author teases that to prop up this so-called love story, the director actually deleted a real-life, wealthy hero from the historical record of the ship, all just to invent the fictional villain named Cal. It's a fascinating question of historical erasure that we will absolutely be unpacking in our next explainer.